principalmente siempre a nuestros patrocinadores, al Banco UBS, a Farmacias del Ahorro, a Cemex, a Cervecería Cuauhtémoc, a Mesafina, al Plan de Educación Educativa del TEC y a todos los que colaboran para que este proyecto sea una realidad. Les damos la bienvenida a este tercer día de conferencias y talleres de Foro KIC. Hoy durante la mañana hablaremos de un tema que será de utilidad para toda mujer que convive con niños o adolescentes o que busca formar una familia en el futuro. La familia y los hijos. Replantearemos nuestra definición de familias exitosas con Madeline Levine. Escucharemos la entrevista de Pilar Cortés a Madeline sobre educación de los hijos en privilegio y el hermoso testimonio de Arturo Pérez con Los hijos son perfectos. Disfrútenlo.
Buenos días, no me ven, ¿verdad? Porque estoy un poquito bajita. Bueno, para mí es un placer presentarles hoy a la doctora Madeline Levine. Yo hace 2 años leí su libro The Price of Privilege, no sé si alguien de ustedes lo leyó en un viaje, venía de regreso de un viaje de trabajo, y de verdad cambió mi vida en la manera en que hemos tratado de educar a nuestros hijos, nos inspiró mucho, nos dio mucha luz. Entonces, y creo que varios de ustedes también lo ha hecho y bueno, por eso la invitamos y es parte de este congreso. Vamos a ver cuestionamientos profundos e interesantes, perspectivas sobre el significado del éxito personal, el de los hijos y el éxito como familia. Una reflexión sobre lo que entendemos como éxito a nivel global y su contraste con el verdadero significado en la vida real. ¿Qué es una familia exitosa si es que existe o si cada quien lo define? Y la importancia de ser congruentes en este tema cuando educamos a nuestros hijos. Madeline es psicóloga y educadora con más de 30 años de experiencia, es best-selling author de New York Times y frecuentemente es invitada como oradora principal en reconocidas instituciones educativas y por líderes de negocios. Después de aquí va a estar un mes entero viajando por todo el mundo, va alrededor, me dice que no entiende. Y bueno, qué privilegio tenerla aquí en Monterrey para luego va a Jordania, va con Rania, la invitaron y va a estar por todo el mundo compartiendo su experiencia. Vive en San Francisco con su esposo y es una orgullosa madre de 3 hijos. Le damos la bienvenida, por favor. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Okay. I've just exhausted my Spanish, so that's it. Thank you. Okay, so that sounds loud. Is it okay? Sounds okay? So if we're going to talk about successful families today, I want to start out by talking about definitions of success and what success means. Success means different things to different people. But in the United States and in my short lecture yesterday from Pilar and Valeria, I learned it's not very different here. So in the United States, success is generally measured in terms of 2 metrics, money and power. And I'm going to suggest that there's a whole other way of looking at it that doesn't say that there's anything wrong with money or power, but that that's not enough for a successful life. I'm not sure that this is going to work here, so we'll see. I've done a particular exercise now in 212 of my last speaking places, and it's worked out every time, but I'm not sure. So we'll see in a minute. I'm sitting in my office. I'm a clinical psychologist, and in my office I have a 9-year-old boy who's sitting on a sofa, pretty much like this in my office, and his feet don't reach the floor. And he's there because he's extremely anxious. And I asked him, a bunch of questions, and one of the questions was, what do you like to do? What do you want to do when you grow up? And he looks right at me and he says, I want to be a venture capitalist or an entrepreneur. Now, Now, there's nothing wrong with being a venture capitalist or an entrepreneur, but there's something wrong with a 9-year-old wanting to be a venture capitalist or an entrepreneur, because he has no idea what either of those jobs mean. Actually, most of us don't exactly know what those jobs mean in the United States, but he had just turned 9. So he should want to be a fireman or a policeman, or he should be down at the creek playing with the frogs and the salamanders, but instead he's already bought into the idea that his life's work should be to make money and to be in a position of power. And I'm going to argue that that's not such a good idea, because in focusing somewhere down the line, 20 years, 30 years, he's mortgaging his childhood. And that if you have your child mortgage their childhood, there are a whole bunch of things that they miss that actually will make it less likely that he'll get to be the entrepreneur, if that's what he wants to be, or the surgeon, or the fireman, or whatever else. So he has this idea. Okay, you can see my skills with technology. Right here they are, right here. Nope. Nope, I'm going the wrong way. And I want you to see what just happened with me, right? I didn't get this right. I don't know how to do it. And it's like, oh my God, this is what life is like, right? Life is like a continuing series of challenges. And there are things we're really good at, like it's very easy for me to get up here and speak, and it's obviously very hard for me to use technology. And I want you to keep that moment in mind where I don't start to cry, and I don't make Pilar come up here and help me, but I figure it out. And that's what kids have to learn how to do. And there are reasons that the way we're parenting now is getting in the way of them learning how to do exactly this kind of thing, which is adults, go on every day, right? Every day. Like you can't get a parking spot, you can't figure out how to use your iPhone, whatever it is, you've got a million little challenges, and you just sort of go about your business and solve them. So now that I have this vaguely right, this is the line that most of the children I treat believe is the road to success, right? They see it as a straight line. They go to the right schools, they work their butts off getting straight A's, they go to a very good private school, then they go do an internship at Goldman Sachs or something like that. I don't know what the equivalent is here. Do you have Goldman Sachs here? Yeah, okay. Then they go, hopefully, to an Ivy League school, end up in some kind of financial job, and they're happy for the rest of their life. That is the story. I work at Stanford. That is the Silicon Valley story of what it takes to be successful. That, or the other story, which is kind of funny, is I'm dropping out of school. Really? How come? Because, school's like really important. Well, Bill Gates dropped out and Steve Jobs dropped out, so I'm dropping out. And it's kind of like, guess what? You are not Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, so stay in school. All right, so that's his idea of a trajectory. I've been told about how many of you women work outside the house? And how many of you don't? Okay, so it's about 50-50. So either for yourself or for your working husband, whoever's working outside the house, how many of you actually followed that straight trajectory? How many of you can say you did it all right? I'm not asking if you're happy or not, just whether you followed that trajectory. Raise your hand so I can see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Did I count you? I got you. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Okay, how many people in the room, Christina? About 200. Okay, so I am, in addition to being technologically impaired, I'm very bad at math. Somebody out here has got to be a math person. 19 out of 200 is what percent? 10%. Okay. So as I said, oops, you can see I'm really impaired in the technology realm. Okay. So I've done this. This is, I think, 217 times. The number always comes out somewhere between 1 and 10%. It's astounding to me. It doesn't matter whether I'm speaking at Google or Microsoft or here in another country or just my local public school. That's about the percentage of people who follow that trajectory. And kids, however, have this idea that everybody has followed that trajectory. Now, if 1 to 10% of people followed that trajectory, that means that the rest of us followed this trajectory, right? You know, you stopped, you started. I was a social worker, I was a teacher, then I became a psychologist, then I became a writer, then I became a speaker. I went to the State University of New York at Buffalo. It's really funny. I co-founded an organization at Stanford called Challenge Success, and my co-founder is Denise Pope. And she went to Harvard and to Stanford, and then back to Harvard, and now she teaches at Stanford. And I went to the State University of New York at Buffalo, and a school that none of you heard of from my PhD and stuff like that. And when we get on a stage together, and people start to think about, well, Denise, you went to Harvard and Stanford, and look, you're really successful. And she'll always say, yeah, but Madeline makes a lot more money than I do. She's better at it. Okay, so that's the trajectory of most of us. And that will be the trajectory of most of your kids as well. So this idea of keeping them on the straight and narrow all the time, I think is a mistake. And what is it that we do to keep them on the straight and narrow, right? We want them to be perfect. They're supposed to be straight A students. They're supposed to be outstanding at their extracurriculars, whether that's sports or music or whatever it is. And we keep it's an adult secret, I believe, that most of us are unbelievably average. See how quiet it gets? You wanted to get quieter? Your kids are incredibly average. Nervous laughter, right? Not my kid, maybe her kid, but not my kid. Try and step back for a minute and think about it, right? Think about the things that you are truly outstanding at. Harvard Business Review did a fabulous study of C-level people, CEOs, CFOs, COOs, top of companies, and they used 32 variables. And they wanted to see how many people had to be outstanding at to rise to the level of a C-level person in an organization. And how many do you think they came up with? How many do you need? And you had to be high. You had to be at the 90th percentile of your peer group. That's a high number. How many of 32 variables did you need to rise to the top of your organization? How many? 100% of 32? Let's try again. No. Not close. Not 0. 3. You needed 3. That's all you needed. Go home after today and think about how many things you're really outstanding at. I'm really good at speaking. I'm really good at writing. I suck at technology. I suck at math. And I'm very average at a whole bunch of things. And my guess is you won't, and I was a very good mom, my guess is you won't find that you're good at everything. And this idea that our kids should be straight A students, it's just not the way it works. In real life, because I'm not good at visual spatial stuff, I didn't become a surgeon. I'm married to a surgeon, but I didn't become a surgeon because I'd be bad at it. I don't know, is basketball big down here? People like basketball? There's an expression in basketball, you go to your right? And that's what we do in life. We go to our strengths. And I have a particular point of view, and maybe in the Q&A we'll discuss it, that we spend way too much time trying to remediate our kids' what we see as deficits, and not enough time cultivating their strengths. Because ultimately, it's their strengths that they're going to follow. So usually, after I give a talk, I'll get a phone call, from a mom who says, yeah, I heard your talk, but my daughter, I'm worried about my daughter. She's got 5 A's and a C. And I don't even have to ask anymore why she's calling. She is not calling about the 5 A's. She's calling about the C. So I'll just start by saying, so what's your daughter C in? And she'll go, chemistry. And I'll say, does she like chemistry? And she says, no, she really hates it. And it's like, guess what? She's not going to be a chemist. So why don't we concentrate instead on the things that she's good at? And I would suggest to you that one of the things you can do with your kids is to let them know about your challenges and to let them know when you fail. Remember, if you have little kids, you look like brilliant to them. You know everything. You know how to get dressed if you have young children. I mean, you know amazing things. And I think if we keep that going, if we don't let kids know that every day, I guarantee you when I leave here and I talk to my kids, I have 3 sons who you'll meet a little later in the presentation, I will tell them, you can't believe it, once again, I couldn't use the clicker. And they'll go, Ma, what's wrong with you? So let your kids know when you make mistakes, okay? Use that as a dinner time conversation. Oh, today the dry cleaning wasn't ready and my suit wasn't ready and I had to do something else, or the car broke down, or whatever, just the flotsam and jetsam of everyday life. If we really believe that this is the trajectory that kids need to take, there are things we have to do differently. Unbelievable. Unbelievable, because you can be not just like not okay, you can really, like I said, you can really suck at something and still be successful out in the world. It's interesting. Okay. And your kids ought to know that, Your kids ought to know that. Okay. Why are we worried? Why are we pushing our kids and pressuring our kids? I'm going to just spend 2 minutes on some disturbing statistics. So Valeria knows I tried very hard to come up with statistics on depression and anxiety and stuff like that for your community. And I can't find them for whatever reason. So I'm going to use my community, which is a very upper middle class to affluent community in Marin County right outside of San Francisco. Nobody had ever looked at the mental health of the kids from affluent families. The assumption always was that those kids were doing well, right? They had the protective factors of money, of involved and invested parents, and of educational opportunities. So the assumption was those are protective factors, they're going to do well. It wasn't until 15 years ago that the first study was ever done on the children of affluent families. And it was done sort of by mistake. A woman named Sunya Luther at Columbia, who was an expert on at-risk kids, inner-city, poverty-stricken, resourceless kids, was doing a study. You always need grant money, and so she wanted a really robust control group. So she's sitting in the office with her graduate assistant and says, who can we use to make my at-risk kids look really bad so I can get my grant? And he goes, well, why don't you go to what's called the Hill schools in New York? That's Fieldston, Horace Mann, those schools, because those kids are going to look really good. So that's what they did, and guess what? Those kids actually looked worse on a whole bunch of variables than her inner-city kids. They had higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety disorders, higher rates of psychosomatic disorders, higher rates of substance abuse, higher rates of self-destructive behavior like self-mutilation or eating disorders, and equally antisocial attitudes, which was the biggest surprise of all. So that was the beginning of people deciding what's going on with the kids from affluent families. And just quickly, here are the numbers. Young children from affluent families look fine. And if anybody who has any thoughts on why that's the case when what happens to them later changes so radically, talk to me, because I've been thinking about this for years. in the 7th grade, there's a precipitous drop in mental health, and at that point, kids have twice the rate of anxiety disorders and depression as the general population. And by the 12th grade, they have 3 times the rate. By the 12th grade, 1 in 4 kids from an affluent family suffers from a clinical diagnosis. I'm not talking about your daughter going into her room and rolling her eyes at you and shutting the door, or whatever, whatever the look is down here. That's the look in the States. I'm talking about clinical depression where kids can't get out of bed, can't function, can't do their schoolwork. That's an unconscionable level of mental distress, emotional distress. And that's just on a clinical diagnosis, let alone the number of kids who feel stressed and unhappy and just sort of feel lost and pressured in their lives. So the numbers are bad. I know we talked a little bit before, Valeria and I, about suicide. Suicide in the United States is way up, apparently not so much here. Substance abuse is way up. I guess it's alcohol here more than actual drug abuse. No? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. It's interesting because the percentage of kids who use medication in some form or another, pot or alcohol or oxycodone, or before I came here, and I'm from a really quite wealthy community, I had to hospitalize in rehab 2 kids with heroin addictions from my own community. So that may not be going on here, but there are lots of bad ways to cope. And how the percentage of kids who say that they need medication in some form or another to cope is 77% of high school kids in the United States. And the percentage, this speaks to what we were talking about, Valeria, the percentage of parents who believe kids need medication to cope is 7%. So there's a huge disconnect between what parents are actually thinking is going on with their kids and what's actually going on with their kids. So, for what it's worth. Okay, so we're worried, right? We're worried about our kids, and it's part of the reason we do all this pressured parenting and a lot of over-parenting. And why are we so worried? Well, in the United States, the economy's not great. So kids, I have 3 sons who are just out in the job market, right? I'm worried about them getting jobs, which they have, but that's what a lot of people are worried about. There's more competition for the same group of schools. They didn't build a new Harvard or a new Stanford. There's just more kids. It's a flat world. There's global competition. We're afraid our kids won't be prepared. And one of the biggest things, I think, is there's pressure on us to fit in with the community values. And materialism has become a kind of a way of life. I was on Fifth Avenue maybe a month ago, and I passed the Gucci store, and there's this window, big window, and in the window there is nothing but one shoe on a pedestal, right, with lights coming down. I mean, it looks like it was supposed to be the crucifixion or something, but it's not. It's a shoe, and it's been raised to a kind of deity, and that's the presentation that kids believe. It doesn't work, by the way. It's not about. I want to be really clear about one thing. This is not about money. There is absolutely no evidence that money is responsible for any of the mental health problems. There is plenty of evidence that says materialism is. So it's about values, not about income. And it's about the values that are transmitted to kids. Okay. So we're worried about these things, and we're worried about him. Right? He's our worst nightmare. That our kid will do all this stuff for our kid, and he will end up, God, he looks very stoned, actually. I see him little on my little slide. He looks pretty stoned up there. We're worried that our kid's going to come back from college, go live in our basement, sit on a couch, play video games, and smoke weed. That's like our worst nightmare. And the point, and won't find a job. And the point is that in order for this kid to find a job, he's going to need a whole bunch of skills that are not being taught in the educational system. I don't know as much about your educational system. Our educational system in the United States doesn't work anymore. We're using an outdated educational system where kids sit at a desk and fill in bubbles and the kind of rote nonsense that was necessary for the industrial age and the agriculture, and even for the information age, even to become a doctor. But it is not necessary and it's not useful anymore when businesses say, no, it's an entirely different skill set that we need. We need creativity, we need adaptability, we need flexibility, we need collaboration, we need cross-cultural stuff, and none of that, unless your school happens to have a socio-emotional learning component, is being taught. And the whole way of teaching on an individual level simply doesn't work. And it feeds this kind of entitlement. So these very special kids, I had this one young man who came from a very wealthy, sort of showy family, and I don't know what birthday party. Are birthday parties down here a big deal for young kids? Yeah, big deal with animals and yeah. So this kid, growing up, he had horses and llamas and like all kinds of things coming to the house for his friends. It's his first job at Google, and it's his first year there, and he comes in and he's practically in tears. And it's like, James, what's the matter? And he goes, well, today was my birthday. And I said, yeah, and he said, all I got was the kid next to me brought me in a cupcake. And I'm thinking, wow, you're really lucky that somebody even noticed that it was your birthday. And he's wondering where the llama is. And, it's sort of like, that doesn't happen out in the world. And to the extent to which kids believe the moon and the stars revolve around them and that they're entitled to this unbelievably special treatment because they're so special, that's my office. That's who's in my office. A bunch of kids who can't believe that the world doesn't treat them the way that their parents did. And I'd suggest to you that they need some practice in how the world's going to treat them before they actually get out there so they have some skills for it. Okay. Because we're worried about our kids, we do something that I call over-parenting. And I wrote a op-ed piece for the New York Times just on this topic, and it's the most emailed op-ed piece in the history of the New York Times. And I wish I could tell you that it was because it was so brilliant or something. It was good. It wasn't brilliant. But, when they called to tell me, it was like, wasn't it about, like, Obama or bin Laden? Or no, because at the end of the day, after we worry about the fiscal cliff and Obama and whatever else you're worried about down here, we worry about our children. That's what we all worry about. And that's why 2 million emails sent out. Okay, so what's over-parenting? This is what the article was about. Well, one thing is doing what our kids can already do. Don't do that. If your kid pretty much knows how to do addition, don't hang around and hover. You're not the night teacher. Your kid has a teacher. You're not the night teacher. Let your kid do his homework. He'll make a mistake or two. Fine, the teacher will correct it. You've gotten that far, it means go call a girlfriend, have a cup of coffee, read a book, do something, but don't hover over your kids. Think about what it feels like when you're being hovered over. How you doing? How you doing? I don't know if do you have this way of getting on the internet here so you can see how your kid's doing in school? Oh, you have that here too? Oh, that's too bad. So in the United States, it's called Power School. I call it Power Snoop because who wants to be looked at every, and it's so seductive, right? Because it's intermittent reinforcement. Sometimes your kid has an A, and sometimes they have a C. Keeps you coming back to see how they're doing. And kids do a great imitation of what it's like to come home, and mom is standing at the door going, so how was school today? And the kid knows that she's not really asking how the kid is. She's asking how he did on the math test that she already knows he passed or he failed or whatever. So try not to do that. If your kid can do it, let him do it. The next one is don't do what your kid can almost do. And this is an incredibly important one to me because I think it's where most learning takes place. In education, we call this the zone of proximal learning or the zone of proximal development. And it's where a kid can't quite do something on their own. So you might ask, well, if they can't quite do it on their own, why aren't we supposed to help them? The reason, you always can come in later, but if you come in too early, you take away the opportunity to learn. So I want to take an example. Okay, say your 8-year-old daughter has been working on a science project for 3 days. It's an important task for her. She wants to do well on it. She's worked really hard, and it's going to count towards her grade. And you know those mornings where you're busy? Anybody have mornings like that? You know? Yeah? Well, so she leaves it on the kitchen table. 8 years old, important science project, going to count. And you take your kids to school, and you come back, and you see it's laying on the table, right? So how many of you, honestly, would bring that up to school for her? Raise your hands. What? And how many of you would not bring it up to school? Well, you got a well-educated group here. Okay. That's really interesting. This usually, what? You'd send the grandmother, did you say? Oh, I asked the wrong question. How many of you would send grandma up with it? Cultural differences. Okay, the right answer to that is don't send it up to school. Don't bring it back. And let me tell you why that's the right answer. It's more complicated than that, but let me tell you why it's the right answer. Because the 8 or 9 or 10-year-old kid who forgets an assignment has an opportunity to have what I call a successful failure. That means it's a developmentally appropriate, handleable challenge that the child can learn from. So he or she is not going to be happy that she forgot her homework or her project. It means that she has to think of 2 things. One, how do you do that better next time? Do you leave a note? Do you put it in the car? Do you tell your mom to remind you? Do you put a sticky on the mirror? What are the logistics of remembering things? But as a psychologist, the more important part to me is that child has to learn how to deal with dysphoria. They have to learn to deal with negative feelings. And I doubt that there's anybody in this room who hasn't had an awful lot of practice in dealing with negative feelings. That's just part of life. So your kid is up at school, right? He's with friends. He's not going to go crazy. He's not going to put his hand through the wall because the teacher's there. He's going to have to or she's going to have to figure out, do I run around the playground? Maybe they'll go in the bathroom and cry for a minute. Maybe they'll talk to a friend. Maybe they'll figure out they need to talk to the teacher. But they will figure out an alternative to the discomfort they're feeling. That's the reason not to do it, because as hard as it sounds, your child has to have a whole bunch of challenging, somewhat unhappy experiences if they're going to learn to deal with them. And that's what life is. Like 200 people, how many people here have never had a serious illness, a loss, a financial reverse, a divorce, a separation? How many of you have never had any of those things? You're a lucky woman, but you're one, 2 out of 200. That's what life is. And one day your kids will be sitting in a seat somewhere, and somebody will say, "How many of you haven't had tragedy, difficulty, challenge?" And they all will. The point of this is not that I like giving kids a hard time. The point is that I know that without kids navigating through some hard times, that they don't have the resources to stand up to life. And these are the kids I see in my office. You ask any child and adolescent psychologist in the United States, we are so packed, we can't handle it. The state university system's in crisis because they can't handle the number of kids who simply can't cope. It's not like the old days where if I saw a kid, they were bipolar or they were schizophrenic or they had... These are kids who simply don't have a skill set for coping with challenge. And that's something that we can easily start imparting to them when they're young. Okay. So don't do what your kid can already do. Let them flounder around in it. You can always come back to it and help them out. And here's the other point I want to make about this. I mentioned my co-founder, Denise. So if we do a scenario like that, like a homework scenario together, she's adamant. I would never bring it up. I've never brought anything up for my kids. It's a terrible idea. You've deprived them of a successful failure. And I used to stand on the stage with her a lot and go, you know, I actually did bring stuff up for my kids once in a while. And I'm telling people not to, so that doesn't feel very aligned. And I thought about it a lot, and here's what I want to tell you, whether you're listening to me or any other expert, and that is that I don't know you or your child or your family or your values, right? And at the end of the day, that is critical. Everything I'm telling you is research-based. Stanford's a very research-based place. So if it's not research-based, I'll tell you. But I'm talking in generalities. It's not any one specific child or home. And everything you hear from an expert has to be filtered through the values of your family and the type of child you have. And what works for one child might be absolutely the wrong thing for the next child. So, you know, this sort of wholesale taking on, like, first they tell you to praise your children, right? That was a big deal when I was raising my, praise them for everything. Lots of trophies all the time. It's sort of like I was at a preschool recently and I just observed, and this child, maybe 3, 4 years old, walks in and mom's right behind him, and the kid is walking across to hang up his coat on the little hook, and mom's right behind him going, good job, good job, good job. The kid is friggin' walking. That's all he's doing. So, you know, praise your child, and now it's don't praise your child. Carol Dweck's work, which shows that if you praise your child too much, you know, they don't do as well as if you don't praise them. So you have to hear it through that particular lens. And when I thought about, well, how come if I don't believe it's a good idea, how come I ever did that? And I didn't do it much, but I did it a little with the 3 kids. I decided it was because in my particular family, for a number of reasons, I've got your back. It's a huge value for me. It's just very, very important for me. And I think on those few times that I brought it up, it felt like I didn't have their back if I didn't bring it up. And sometimes I think about it, you know, I do a tremendous amount of speaking, and most of it is easy, but every once in a while, I do something really out of the ordinary, like going to Midland, Texas, and talking at the fundamentalist evangelical church. That was different. So I need my cards, right? And I keep thinking, well, what if I left them on the table and my husband came down and saw them and said, you know, it's a good time to teach Madeline about successful failure. I'm not going to tell her about her cards, right? So I would not be happy with that. So just filter whatever you hear through the lens of your family, your kid, and what matters to you. Okay. The third one, which is the most toxic, is don't confuse your own needs with your children. Don't bleed onto your kids. Don't confuse what you lacked or were missing or wish you had with your children. And I'm going to tell you a small story about that. The coolest thing about being a psychologist is you never have to make anything up. You just sit in your office and you wait for it to come to you. And it does, eventually. So I'm sitting in my office with a father and a son who I know well because the son played lacrosse with my youngest son. And nobody's crazy, great family. They're there because a very, very smart kid, and he's getting ready to go to college. And now apparently it's not enough to just have the school counselor tell your kid college options. In the United States, you pay $8,000 in addition for a college counselor. And then apparently you have to go to the shrink for the, you know, the blessing or something. So they're in my office, and the kid doesn't want to be there, and the dad is like rigor mortis. He's not saying a word, and it's clear that mom has said to him, be quiet and let your son talk, right? Because he's like this. And the kid starts with kind of the holy trinity of schools in California, which is, I don't know, Cal, Stanford, and UCLA or Pomona, something like that, Caltech. and Dad doesn't say a word, and the kid starts to make his way across the country. You know, he's at Wisconsin, he's at Madison, he's in Michigan, and he gets to Dartmouth, and finally he says, well, and this is a kid who probably could get in anywhere if it was just on merit, but by the way, that's not the way it works anymore. The number of spots are so small, and the number of kids are so qualified that they really should be doing a lottery system. It is not about parents who come into my office and say, what do you think about sending my child to Nigeria to start an orphanage? And it's like, why don't you send your child to Costco or Target and have them just show up for a job? You know, this business of upping the ante on, it used to be Habitat for Humanity down here with Carter, but that's, you know, been there, done that. That doesn't look good on a resume anymore. So I think people are jeopardizing their kids' safety, sending them to more and more remote places. I think it's crazy. If you want your kid, it's critical that your kid work, send them to the local supermarket or something. Have them just get up and understand what it means to be part of a team, to be expected to be on time for work, to be responsible for your own work and not put it on other people. Okay, so the kid finally gets to Harvard and says, well, I guess I could go to Harvard. At which point this half-dead father jumps off the couch and says, now there's the school I would give my left testicle to get my son into. I'm telling you, you just wait. You shrink, you just wait. You know, let the craziness come into the room. And without going through this dad's whole story, because there's always a story behind when we're crazy. Like, how many of you have ever heard yourself sound crazy with your children? If you didn't raise your hand, you're lying. I know you're lying. Because we all sound crazy from time to time. And when we do, check out the meaning for you of what's happening. Is it your own disappointment? Is it your own loss? Is it your own stuff that's coming through? And without going through this whole scenario, Dad is one of 4 kids. 3 of them went to Harvard. He didn't. And by God, his kid was going to go to show the family he was just as good as his brothers. And it's often, not always, but often a story like that. So what do I do with this dad, right? I don't know what to do with him. The kid's like beside himself. And the father is, you know, he knows he's like off base because he understands that a 17-year-old kid has so many developmental tasks. 17 is when most kids have first sexual intercourse, 16 actually. It's when intimacy becomes an issue for them. He's the captain of his lacrosse team. They're in the finals. That's a big deal for him. He's got a zit. All of a sudden, he's breaking out because he's stressed, and he's embarrassed because he's got his first girlfriend. He walks to the blackboard, and every once in a while, he's uncomfortable down there. Stuff is happening with his body that he doesn't understand. Being a teenager is a tremendously challenging task in and of itself, let alone having to get an A in calculus, right? So what the dad and I end up deciding is you can go online, and for $1.75, you go to the Harvard bookstore, you buy a bumper sticker, you put it on, and he can drive around town and say, make it look like I got a kid going to Harvard, right? You know, and it takes care of his need, and it leaves the kid out of it. So when you're aware that it's you, not your kid, your own needs, check it out. Check it with a girlfriend or your partner or shrink or whatever. But try not to make it your kid's issue, okay? I ran through the elevated rates of affluent kids before. Why do they have such elevated rates? Well, I've talked about this. They're expected to be good at everything, which they can't be. There's a risk reward. You can push your kid hard enough maybe to get, you have GPA, is that what it's called here? Grade point average? Same thing. You can push them so that A minus becomes an A. In these hill schools that I was talking about, a tutor is $1,000 an hour. I don't know what that translates into here, but it's an outrageous amount of money. It's an outrage. And who gets that tutor? You think it's the kid who's failing? It's the A minus student all the time, because parents believe. And who is it? It's the guy who used to run NASA or something. Parents believe that with just a little more effort, that A minus could be an A, and that'll be the difference between getting into Yale and having to go to the state school. Now, here's the research on getting into Yale or not. So Yale did a very long longitudinal study looking at kids who were admitted, so they were all smart kids, those who went, and those who didn't and had to go to less prestigious schools. They didn't have the money, mom was sick, whatever it was. And after 1 year, the kids who went to Yale had a slight advantage in terms of salary and satisfaction with jobs. Slight. After 10 years, they were indistinguishable from each other. So this idea that the school makes the kid is wrong. What you want to do is find the right match for your school, and I'll talk about that more later. But the evidence, I know everybody thinks, if I could just get my kid into this place, they'll do fine. It's wrong. There's a whole bunch of things we believe, and just because we believe them doesn't make it right. The evidence is that as an undergraduate, the school you go to does not make any difference in your long-term outcome. The bell curve is not additive. I don't have any guys here today. It's interesting. We tend to marry people with very similar IQs to us. And there is a degree of heritability in IQ, but very often people think it's additive. So if mom has an IQ of 140 and dad has an IQ of 130, I'll often have parents in my office saying, but we're both so smart, as if their kid's going to have an IQ of 270. Put it together, right? It doesn't work that. If anything, there's something called regression to the mean, where if you have two outstanding people out there on the bell curve, it's just as likely that their kid's going to move towards the middle. So it's not additive. The other thing is, if kids are constantly pressured on the outside, they have, and this is the most critical, this is my real interest, I have two real interests. It's how kids develop a sense of self. If you're constantly telling kids how to think, what's important, what they should study, what they're good at, they don't have an internal sense of motivation. And we want, at the end of the day, we want our kids to be internally motivated. We want them to be lifelong learners. We don't want performers. And right now what we're turning out is performers, because there isn't much spark internally. And I see this every day in my office. I see a young girl who I've been seeing for a while, and she comes in, she's very smart. She wants to be a doctor. She takes Adderall to stay up to study, Red Bull in the morning, learns the stuff, forgets it by the end of the test, and is proud of that. She says, I know how to do it. I'm a straight A student. I don't remember anything, but I can get straight A's. I do not want her to be my doctor, and neither do you, right? Because she really isn't an engaged learner. And that's what you want from your children. Be willing to trade performance for engagement. Engagement is by engagement, I mean the kid who's interested, who's turned on, who really likes doing something, who wants to learn. And by the way, that can be in almost anything. It doesn't have to be calculus or, French literature or whatever. It can be anything. When my oldest kid used to play Little League, Junior League, Little League, and there was this weird kid on the team. Every team has that kid whose parents are insisting that he play like he couldn't hit the Pacific Ocean with a ball if he tried, but his parents are, it's like really good for you, and he's mortified, and so they stick him as far out in left field as possible because he can't catch anything. And on those rare occasions when the ball is coming towards him, you can't find him, because I live in a wooded area, because he's made his way out into the woods. Now we would say maybe he has Asperger's, I don't know, he's on the spectrum, I don't know what we'd say about him, but back then, he was just weird Tony, because he liked plants more than he liked baseball. You know, fast forward, Tony is now the head of botany at one of the major institutions in the United States. So anything that a child is turned on by, is interested in, has the potential to be a lifelong pursuit. My favorite question that comes to me is, Dr. Levine, my daughter, she's just so social, and she's just talking all the time in class, and she's like always solving her friends' problems, and what is she going to do with that when she grows up? And it's like, really? You're asking a psychologist? Well, there's lots of things she can do with that when she grows up. So be open to the range of things that kids learn. And the other thing is, if we're pushing our kids, and this is the thing that drives me crazy, no child gets to rest where they are. So, again, this was on this trip to New York. I'm walking down Fifth Avenue, and I'm right in front of Bergdorf Goodman. And there's a mom walking ahead of me with a beautifully dressed little boy. You know, he's got saddle shoes and little shorts on. He's maybe 3 years old. And it's drizzling. So there's a puddle right outside the store. And the little kid sees the puddle, and like any good 3-year-old, he jumps in it. And mom goes crazy on Fifth. She's crying, and she's yelling, and I'm right behind her. And with some kind of narcissism of my own, I go up and I say, hello, I'm Dr. Levine. You seem really upset. Can I help you? And she's like, go away. And what happened? They were on their way to his preschool interview, and now he was dirty. And it didn't occur to her that a preschool teacher might see that as a big plus, as opposed to looking like little Lord Fauntleroy or, you know, that kind of thing. She just knew she didn't have time to get him home and get him cleaned up. Kids need to rest in the developmental stage they're at, and we do no service. We actually harm them by pushing them forward. I don't know if it was Baby Einstein a popular video here? How many of you ever had anything like a Baby Einstein video? Oh, wow, everybody. Okay, take a deep breath. The research on Baby Einstein is that it retards language acquisition by 16% per month. University of Washington, University of Oregon research. Now, since you all said you did it, don't worry, because my guess is you did a whole lot of other things that were good. But Baby Einstein by itself retards language acquisition. Why? Why, right? Because it was surprising even to me. I figured maybe it doesn't do much, but why would it retard it? Well, think about how your child learns to speak. Children are driven to speak anyway because they want to communicate with you. They sit on your lap, you're making eye contact, they're playing with your hair, your glasses, your earrings, whatever. You're having a love fest, right? And now we know there's something called mirror neurons, so actually your neurons are dancing with each other. That kind of attachment is what's going on, and it's what's motivating the child to get better at something. It's in the relationship. Contrast that scene with taking your kid, putting them in a bimbo, bombo, whatever people put their kids in now, and setting them in front of a screen. No attachment, no mirror neurons, none of the warmth of the relationship. And I think I don't think, that's the research on why it doesn't work. And every time we push our kids ahead, in Florida, a little kid comes up to me, really little, like 3 years old, and he's pulling on my pants leg, and I get down and I go, what is it, honey? And he's very proud, and he said, he's a little white kid with blonde hair and blue eyes, and he's very proud, and he says, I speak Chinese. And I'm like, cool, how come? And he looks up at me and he says, because I want to go to Harvard. And he's 3. He's supposed to be learning not to hit his friend over the head with a shovel in the sandbox, not planning his college career. And it's not just because I'm crabby, it's because it gets, which I am at this point about some of this stuff, but it gets in the way of what he's really supposed to be doing. I mean, it's great to learn another language. That's not the point. But the point is the developmental task quickly of like preschoolers is self-control. Self-control. Don't hit your friend because you're going to go to school. You're going to have to raise your hand. You're not going to be able to run out of the room. And self-control is like lifetime. You know, I do a little meditation and like I didn't do it this morning. And how many times is your gym bag sitting there while you're having a piece of chocolate cake? I mean, self-control is always an issue. It's a huge issue for young children. What's the issue? One of the issues for elementary school kids? Exploration. Let them try a bunch of stuff. Don't make them be on the traveling team, because if they're on the soccer traveling team, they're never going to learn if lacrosse was really their sport. Let them experiment. Adolescence, identity, right? So when your daughter, save your battles. When your daughter comes and her hair is green or blue or whatever it is, that's not your fight. It's when she's doing something that's really damaging or dangerous to her. You know, I always say, forget the haircut, save it for the piercings, or something like that, you know, depending on what you can tolerate. But don't think that you can push kids ahead without sacrificing their emotional well-being. It can't be done. I said this already. Kids are more stressed by academics than anything else. Now, that is out of line with what we know. Kids historically have been most stressed by family. Getting divorced, mom's hitting dad's hitting mom. Or you're not allowed to sit at the table with your best friend all of a sudden. Those are the issues that have always stressed kids the most. Now, it's school. Was that really my next slide? Huh. Okay, sure. So what protects kids? And I'm going to make the case, and I'm going to use my own kids as an example, that what protects kids is taking the time to really, really know who your child is. To spend the amount of time it takes to become intimately knowledgeable about your child. And that's not when you're running around. I had 3 kids, one's in soccer, one's in lacrosse, one's in tap dance. That's not when you're racing and yelling, you forgot your cleats, I'm not going home for them, you know, you're going to pay for the sweat. That's not it. You need what I call an inviting, listening presence. Just kind of that quiet time every day when you're with your kids. And you also have to know their style of learning. And I think the things that we value, some of them are incredibly valuable, and there's a new set of skills that are becoming more valuable. I was on a panel with a man named Mirzi Jabali, who was one of the head engineers of NASA, and I got him in a corner, so I got to ask the questions people always ask me in corners, which is, are kids going to get jobs? You know, or are you going to bring over like all these Indian and Chinese kids from overseas, and are they going to take all the jobs away? And what he said, he's an Indian, obviously by his name, and he said, in terms of content, you know, our education system is all about content. In terms of content, American kids are as good as anybody in the world. In terms of this other, what we used to think of as a soft set of skills, in terms of entitlement, in terms of social relations, they're horrible. And he tells me the story of just hiring a kid from Stanford, and he says to him, your annual report will be, and it's a Stanford kid, he's smart. He doesn't know what the word annual means. He says, annual? And the guy says, yeah, your annual report. And he says, do you mean once a year? And the guy says, yeah, that's what annual means. And the kid says, you can't just tell me how I'm doing once a year. I need you to tell me like every day, how am I doing? Well, no company has the resources for that. And this has changed in the last, I'd say 2 years, about a third of the speaking things that I do is now like American Express or Morgan Stanley or big companies. And, you know, I can't balance a checkbook, so I don't know what they want with me, except they're very concerned about the kind of kids they're getting. They keep saying, we're getting kids who know how to follow directions, who get the content right, but they're not creative, they're not going to take us to the next level. Why is that? And I keep saying, well, where are you getting your kids from? And it's the same 12 schools every time. And it's like, well, if that's how you triage, you're going to get the same kid over and over. What do you want? We want gritty kids. We want kids who think outside the box. It's like try the state school, where a kid's working 2 jobs to put himself through school if what you want is persistence and a work ethic. And more, that's becoming a model for businesses, is to expand the way that they triage. All right, so I was talking about 3 kinds of intelligence. Conventional, that's the kid who does really well in school, the analytic thinker, the creative thinker, and the hands-on thinker. And I was lucky enough, my house was a living laboratory, so I was lucky enough to have one of each of those kids. And there are my boys. And what? I like carrying them with me, And the reason they're up there is to talk a little bit because I am sure that all of you have different kids as well, and that the school system treats them very differently. So this is my oldest son's law school graduation, the one on my left. So that's your right, thank you. Be honest when you go home and think about these things. Okay, so he's graduating law school, straight A student, student athlete, went up to school 1 million times. The school system served him pretty well. And it was before things were so crazy also. Now, I think what we do with our brightest kids is we stress them terribly and we marginalize the rest of kids. But this was from a while ago. He did fine. When he graduated Redwood High School, so they have red gowns, and he had gold stripes and gold things hanging off of him and looked like a Christmas tree at the front of the line. And, I was very proud of him, and he was proud of himself. He had to work hard to do that. That's the kind of mind that schools tend to teach to, right? They like those kinds of kids. The problem with those kinds of kids, I can say because it's my own, is they're more interested in the right answer than anything else. That's all this kid wanted, was to get it right. And I think he sacrificed some degree of intellectual curiosity as a result of that. But he ended up in a field that suited him, and school was good to him. This kid, I won't bother with where it is, this child, who looks like their father, I think, in that picture, he's my middle son. He was the creative child. And he hates this part of my talk, hates it. Because what he says with justification is, thanks a lot, I'm the creative child, I can never be the smart one. Thank you. When I was on Katie Couric's show, he was in the wings, and he said, if you do that creative bit about me, I am going to out you on national television. But he doesn't quite understand that I have an hour and 10 minutes to make a lot of points. So, creative kid, right? And in affluent communities, we like the arts, right? We support the opera and the symphony and dance, and we really like the arts. We just really don't want our children to be in them. And he's the only kid I ever got called up to school on. Why? And he also did very well in school, but he didn't care at all. So I'd get called up like once a year, twice a year, and they'd say, Madeline, your son is disrespectful about learning, and I'd have to go up, and what did he do? He'd get his tests back, and he usually did pretty well, so he'd get 1 or 2 things wrong. He'd look at it, and right in front of the teacher, he'd take it, crumple it up, and throw it in the waste paper basket. And it was like, Michael, what? And he would say to me, and I have sympathy for his point of view, he would say, what am I supposed to do? It's like 1 of 100 tests. Am I supposed to frame it? What? And it was like, just don't do it right in front of the teacher. Just walk in the hall and get rid of it, right? So school was okay for him because, like I said, we liked the arts. And when I talk in a school, 90% of the time I'm in a theater that was built. And when he graduated, he had some of that regalia on him, but he didn't care because he sewed up his gown and turned it into a suit and decoupaged it, and he couldn't care less. But my heart is with, in this particular respect, my heart's with all my kids, but my heart in terms of talking about how I got interested in this is with my perfectly average son, Jeremy. Jeremy is so average, my middle kid, that Redwood High School had 1,600 kids, and he was number 800 in the school. So it was like, oh, thank you, you made the talk really easy. And he had a learning disability, total hands-on kid. If he could touch it, he could learn it, and if he couldn't touch it, and school for a lot of boys, especially middle school, is like Dante's Ninth Circle, right? You take boys who need to move and touch, and you tell them to sit down and don't move for 6 hours. I mean, you could drive them insane that way. But school, so he was a very average student, but what he needed to do, and this is a good outcome for a kid who's an average student, was to figure out other things that he was good at. So he worked every summer in construction, which is a great thing for kids to work in. And in my community, all the workers, construction workers, are Hispanic, so he was on a team with 11 Hispanic guys, and he couldn't understand how they could feed a family on $12 an hour, which is what they all made. So he would wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning every day and make lunch for that whole team so that they could save their lunch money to feed the family. Now, I like that story because that's who that child is. He cultivated more and more a whole bunch of soft skills of empathy, of integrity, of honesty, and worked on, and you have to work. If you have a kid who doesn't fit the mold, worked on the skills that he was really, really good at, but that weren't taught in the school. As a matter of fact, because I was there to bother them, they actually put in an engineering track in Redwood High School, 4 years. It was engineering, it was computer-assisted drawing, it was architecture, but it was shop as well. And because it was shop, they never bothered to have it okayed for the state university system, so every A he ever got didn't count.